One ordinary morning turned extraordinary at the Central Bank of Bangladesh when a routine check of a printer revealed a disturbing secret $1 billion was mysteriously missing. On a day that began like any other, bank employees expected to see a continuous stream of transaction reports printing as usual. Instead, they were met with silence. The printer, crucial for tracking massive money movements, was eerily quiet. This was no simple paper jam, it was the first clue to one of the largest bank heists in history. Behind this stillness was a precisely planned strategy by clever burglars who were able to breach the bank's digital firewall undetected. They didn't just steal a small chunk, they aimed to drain a whopping $1 billion from a nation's reserves, putting the economic stability of millions at risk. As the banks scrambled to understand how their secure systems were compromised, the world watched, learning just how vulnerable even the mightiest institutions could be. This story goes beyond a simple theft. It's about how a small printer glitch revealed a massive $1 billion robbery, leading to a nationwide crisis. Let's rewind back to that morning that changed everything in global banking. One day in February 2016, the employees at the Central Bank of Bangladesh noticed something unusual. The printer connected to their SWIFT system had stopped working. This might not seem like a big deal, but for a bank handling international transactions, it was a significant problem. The SWIFT system is a secure global network used by banks to process money transfers between countries, and the printer provides vital backup records. Without these printed records, the bank couldn't confirm if their transactions were being processed correctly. At first, the staff assumed it was just a minor glitch and spent the day trying to fix it, but nothing worked. As the day came to an end, the staff decided to leave the problem for the next day. The next morning, when the essential staff came back to work, they noticed the printer was still not working. This was unusual because by now they should have had a pile of transaction receipts from the night before. Instead, there was nothing. After several hours of trying different fixes, something unexpected happened. The printer suddenly started working again. It began printing out all the transaction receipts that had been queued up since the previous day. As the employees watched the printer churn out the receipts, they felt a sense of relief. Finally, they could get back to business as usual. But as they started sorting through the printed documents, their relief quickly turned to shock. Among the printed transactions were 35 requests that no one at the bank had authorized. These weren't small amounts either. These were transactions totaling nearly $1 billion, and they were all headed to various accounts in the Philippines. The staff quickly tried to figure out how this could have happened. They checked the SWIFT system, but there were no signs of unauthorized access. Everything seemed normal, except for those 35 transactions. It was as if the money had simply disappeared into thin air. The first thing they did was try to stop the money from leaving their accounts. But this wasn't as easy as it sounded. The transactions had already been processed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where Bangladesh Bank held its reserves. This meant that the money was already on its way to the Philippines. The staff frantically tried to contact the Federal Reserve to stop the transfers, but there was a big problem. It was Saturday in America, and the Federal Reserve was closed for the weekend. There was no one there to respond to their urgent requests. The staff also began to suspect that this was no ordinary hacking group. The scale and complexity of the attack suggested that there was a powerful entity behind it. But who could it be? And why would they target Bangladesh Bank? As the employees of Bangladesh Bank sat in their offices, anxiously waiting for Monday to arrive, they couldn't help but wonder how the hackers had managed to pull off such an audacious heist. The first clue came from the digital logs, or rather, the lack of them. Normally, every transaction processed through the SWIFT system is logged digitally, creating a record that can be checked and verified by the bank's employees. But in this case, the hackers had managed to bypass the logging system entirely. This meant that they had gained access to the bank's network in a way that allowed them to hide their tracks completely. One of the key methods they used was something known as social engineering. This is a technique where hackers trick people into giving them access to secure systems, usually by pretending to be someone they trust. In this case, the hackers had likely sent emails to several bank employees, posing as someone they knew, like a colleague or a job applicant. These emails contained attachments that, when opened, would install malware on the employee's computer. This gave them access to the employees' login credentials, which they could then use to access the bank's network. Over time, the hackers would have gained access to more and more of the bank's systems, eventually reaching the most critical part, the SWIFT terminal itself. This is the computer that processes all of the bank's international transactions. By the time the hackers reached this terminal, they would have had everything they needed to carry out the heist. But there was one more obstacle they needed to overcome: the printer. The bank's SWIFT terminal was connected to the printer, which automatically printed out transaction receipts for every international transfer made through the system. So they devised a plan. Using the malware they had installed on the bank's network, they sent a command to the printer, causing it to stop working just before they initiated the fraudulent transfers. This would make it look like the printer had simply malfunctioned, giving them enough time to carry out the heist without being immediately detected. At around 8:30 p.m. on Thursday, February 4th, 2016, the hackers made their move. They logged into the SWIFT terminal using the credentials they had stolen from the bank employees. From there, they submitted 35 transfer requests totaling nearly $1 billion to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. By Friday morning, the first 4 transactions, totaling $81 million, had already been completed. The money had been sent to the accounts in the Philippines, and there was no immediate way to stop it. But then, something unexpected happened. The remaining 31 transactions, totaling $870 million, were flagged for manual review. This wasn't because the Federal Reserve suspected anything was wrong, rather, it was due to a simple coincidence. The address of one of the recipient accounts included the word Jupiter, which happened to be the name of a company that had been blacklisted by the U.S. government for violating sanctions against Iran. This was a stroke of luck for Bangladesh Bank. If it hadn't been for this random coincidence, the entire $1 billion might have been transferred out of their account before they even knew what had happened. But even though the majority of the money was still in the Federal Reserve, the $81 million that had already been transferred was now out of their hands. By the time the employees at Bangladesh Bank discovered what had happened, it was already too late to stop the first set of transfers. Their only hope now was to recover the remaining funds before the Federal Reserve processed the rest of the transactions. But this was easier said than done. The employees tried to contact the Federal Reserve to stop the remaining transfers, but as mentioned earlier, it was now Saturday in the US, and the Federal Reserve was closed for the weekend. The employees also tried reaching out to the banks in the Philippines where the money had been sent, but they encountered another problem: the Chinese New Year holiday was being observed in the Philippines, meaning the banks there were also closed. On Sunday, when the employees returned to work, they immediately went back to the SWIFT terminal to see if there was any way they could stop the remaining transfers. But when they tried to access the terminal, they found that it had been completely locked down. The hackers had wiped all traces of their activity from the system, and the terminal was now unresponsive. By the time Monday morning arrived, the situation had become even more dire. They continued to send urgent messages to the Federal Reserve and the banks in the Philippines, pleading with them to freeze the accounts and stop the money from leaving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they received a response. The Federal Reserve had reviewed the flagged transactions and determined that they were indeed suspicious. They agreed to halt the remaining transfers, effectively saving the bank from losing an additional $870 million. However, the $81 million that had already been sent was still missing. The employees at Bangladesh Bank now turned their attention to recovering the stolen funds. They contacted the banks in the Philippines, urging them to freeze the accounts that had received the money. But once again, they encountered a roadblock. The banks in the Philippines informed them that the money had already been withdrawn, converted into local currency, and laundered through various casinos. As the investigation continued, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary cybercrime. The scale and complexity of the attack suggested that the hackers were part of a highly organized and well-funded group, possibly backed by a nation-state. After the dust began to settle at Bangladesh Bank, the focus shifted to finding the culprits behind this massive heist. International investigators, cybersecurity experts, and intelligence agencies from several countries quickly joined forces to track down the perpetrators. The first step in the investigation was to analyze the malware that had been used to infiltrate Bangladesh Bank's network. Cybersecurity experts dissected the malware, looking for clues that could lead them to the hackers. They found that the malware had been custom-built for the attack, with features that allowed the hackers to remain hidden while they studied the bank's systems. It also had the ability to create backdoors into the network, which the hackers used to maintain access and control. One of the most telling discoveries was the code itself. As the experts examined the malware, they noticed similarities between this code and other known cyber attacks. The structure, techniques, and even some specific lines of code matched those used in a previous high-profile attack, the 2014 breach of Sony Pictures. This attack, which had been widely publicized, involved the hacking of Sony's internal systems and the release of sensitive data, including emails and confidential information. The Sony hack had been attributed to a group known as Lazarus. This group was notorious for its cyber attacks on major corporations and financial institutions around the world. What made Lazarus particularly dangerous was its suspected ties to a nation-state, North Korea. The group had been linked to various cyber operations believed to be sponsored by the North Korean government, aimed at disrupting and destabilizing targets deemed hostile to the regime. The similarities between the Bangladesh bank heist and the Sony hack were too striking to ignore. Investigators now had a prime suspect, the Lazarus Group, but proving this connection was another matter entirely. The Lazarus Group was known for its ability to cover its tracks, making it difficult to trace their activities back to any specific individuals or locations. As investigators continued to dig deeper, they found more evidence linking the Lazarus Group to the heist. For instance, they discovered that the IP addresses used during the attack were connected to servers that had been previously identified as part of Lazarus's infrastructure. Additionally, some of the email addresses and domain names used in phishing attempts against Bangladesh bank employees were similar to those used in other Lazarus-related attacks. But there was also a geopolitical angle to consider. North Korea had been under strict international sanctions for years, severely limiting its access to global financial systems. The Lazarus Group had been linked to various cybercrimes aimed at generating revenue for the North Korean regime, including bank heists, ransomware attacks, and cryptocurrency thefts. The Bangladesh bank heist fit this pattern perfectly, a large-scale operation designed to steal a significant amount of money that could then be funneled back to North Korea. As the investigation continued, the trail led to the Philippines, where the stolen $81 million had been laundered through local casinos. The money had been deposited into accounts at the RCBC Bank, withdrawn in cash, and then exchanged for casino chips. This process made the money virtually untraceable, as it was mixed with legitimate funds within the casino industry. Despite the best efforts of the investigators, recovering the stolen money proved to be nearly impossible. The money had been dispersed across multiple casinos and laundered through various channels, making it difficult to trace. Moreover, the individuals involved had used fake identities and had fled the country before they could be apprehended. One of the few leads the investigators had was a bank manager at RCBC who had played a key role in facilitating the transactions. This manager, identified as Maya DeGuido, had approved the large cash withdrawals and had allegedly cooperated with the middlemen. DeGuido was eventually arrested and charged with money laundering, but she denied any involvement in the heist itself. She claimed that she had been following orders from higher-ups and had no knowledge of the true nature of the transactions. As the investigation dragged on, it became clear that the Lazarus Group had executed one of the most successful bank heists in history. Not only had they managed to steal $81 million, but they had also evaded capture and left very few clues behind. The international community was left grappling with the implications of such a sophisticated attack, and the realization that no bank, no matter how secure, was truly safe from cybercriminals. The Bangladesh bank heist was a wake-up call for financial institutions around the world. It highlighted the vulnerabilities in global banking systems and the need for stronger cybersecurity measures. It also underscored the growing threat posed by nation-state-sponsored cybercrime, where hacking groups like Lazarus could operate with impunity, causing massive financial and reputational damage. In Bangladesh, the immediate fallout was severe. The heist had shaken the country's financial system to its core. The loss of $81 million was a significant blow to Bangladesh's economy, especially considering that the country was still developing and relied heavily on its foreign reserves. The heist led to widespread outrage, with many questioning how the country's central bank could have been so easily breached. The governor of Bangladesh Bank, along with several other top officials, resigned in the wake of the heist. There was immense pressure from both the government and the public to hold someone accountable for the disaster. The resignations were seen as an attempt to restore confidence in the bank, but they did little to address the underlying issues that had allowed the heist to happen in the first place. In the meantime, the government launched a full-scale investigation into the heist. They enlisted the help of international cybersecurity experts and law enforcement agencies from around the world to trace the stolen money and bring the culprits to justice. However, as time passed, it became increasingly clear that recovering the stolen funds would be nearly impossible. The money had been expertly laundered and dispersed, making it extremely difficult to trace.